No doubt, she loved her mother-in-law, but to Ruth, more was involved. She regarded it as a covenant relationship. Her example was a living interpretation of Genesis 2. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife. Notice two familiar words in this passage. One, leave. Not to leave. This represented the breaking with the past, such as former familiar obligations. Two, cleave. This represented a bonding, a new covenant relationship that takes priority in one's life. These are the exact words used in Genesis chapter 2. She demonstrated an incredible depth in her devotion to Naomi. While this was obviously not their marriage relationship, it magnified the proper attitude necessary for any relationship to endure the test of time. This high level of commitment was a characteristic of Ruth that would, as we will see, spill over into every relationship that she had after that. It indicates what kind of wife, mother, believer, friend, and employee that she would be. Some people take their commitment to marriage lightly. Some of you do. One man wrote, "I hope my wife will never divorce me because I love her with all my heart," he says. But if one day she tells me I am minimizing her or making her feel inferior, or in any way standing in the light of what God intended her to be, I hope she will be free to throw me out even if she's 100 years of age. There is something more important than us staying married, and it has to do with integrity, personhood, and purpose. That is just irresponsible. Staying is the act of integrity and personhood, if you want to call it that. Number two, she pledged her commitment without reservation. Naomi revealed her decision in the passage in the most beautiful statement of commitment in printed literature, you might argue. Its beauty and simplicity reminds us of the characteristics of genuine commitment to a relationship. One, it is costly. She had to sacrifice a great deal personally to stay in this relationship. She gave up her one, her future, entreat me not to leave you. She was willing to sacrifice all her freedom from the responsibility of caring for Naomi. When Ruth's husband died, She was probably not more than 25 years of age. For all she knew, she would never remarry or have children. But as a widow, she committed to care for her aging, widowed mother-in-law. This was a complete break from the past, without any promises for the future for her. 2, her familiarity. Wherever you go, I will go as well. She was willing to sacrifice her national identity. She was leaving the land where she was born and raised, Moab, for a land with new and strange customs. How she would be received is the question, people of the world. 3, her family and friends were, my people shall be your people. She was willing to sacrifice a close relationship with family. She was leaving behind her mother, extended family, and friends as well. 4, her faith. Your God shall be my God, she said. She was willing to sacrifice her religious heritage and the worship of the idols. We would consider this her conversion, if you like to call it that. This was a costly decision for her. 2, it is long term. A college man walked into a photography studio with a framed picture of his girlfriend. He wanted the picture duplicated. This involved removing it from the frame. In doing this, the studio owner noticed the inscription on the back of the photograph: "My dearest Tom, I love you with all my heart," the message said. "I love you more and more each day, forever and ever. I am yours for eternity." That's what the message said. And the sign Diane. And it contained P.S. if we ever break up, I want this picture back. Wow. So conditional. In contrast, notice Ruth's statement: "Where you die, I will die," she said. Now, that sounds like a death do us apart kind of commitment, if you ask me. She didn't approach relationship with the attitude that if things get tough or don't work out the way I want, I can simply leave. No. She had, if things don't work out, I will work harder attitude-wise. That's what she said. This certainly implies faithfulness, as a matter of fact. Further, this type of commitment is the glue that holds relationships together when adversity tests them. Thirdly, it is sacred. The Lord do so. She didn't just make this vow to Naomi, she also made this vow to God as well. We still do this at weddings so that we will remember that God sanctions the home. By invoking the name of God, she made her pledge of commitment complete by saying that. She made a physical, emotional, and spiritual vow. There were no reservations in what she said. 3, she proved her commitment. Every year, thousands of couples pledge their love and devotion to each other, only to break that promise later on. Ruth proved her commitment in 2 ways. 1, convincing words. Ruth's vow pulsated a deep, passionate meaning. Her words didn't have a hollow ring to it. Further, based upon her past example, Naomi had no reason to question Ruth. 2, consistent works. Ruth followed through with her vow. She left Moab with Naomi and moved to Bethlehem. Notice, however, that Naomi did not fully appreciate Ruth. The Lord has brought me home again. Ruth's commitment was not dependent on Naomi's commitment or behavior. So how do we conclude this, you might be asking? Dr. Richard Seltzer, a surgeon, wrote, "I stand by the bed where a young woman lies, her face post-operative, her mouth twisted in palsy, clownish, a tiny twig of the facial nerve, the one to the muscles of her mouth, has been severed. She will be incapacitated from now on." The surgeon has followed with religious fervor the curve of her flesh. So, I promise you that, nevertheless, to remove the tumor in her cheek, I had to cut the little nerve, he said. Her young husband is in the room. He stands on the opposite side of the bed, and together they seem to swell in the evening limelight. Isolated from me private, who are they? I asked myself, the doctor said. He and this rhyme out I have made, who gaze and touch each other so generously, greedily. The young woman speaks. "Will my mouth always be like this?" she asked. Yes, I say it will. It is, because the nerve was cut. She nods in a silent, but the young man smiles and says, "I like it. It is kind of cute," the young man says. All at once, I know who he is. I understand, and I lower my gaze. One is not bold in an encounter with a God. Unmindful, he bends to kiss her crooked mouth, and eyes so close can see how he twists his own lips to accommodate hers, to show her that the kiss still works. Wow, how comforting. Life is full of challenges and difficulties and even difficult circumstances. While one cannot control the actions of another person, he or she can make the commitment to hold the family together. So this is the question of where is this all leading? That is the key question. If you believe in luck, then you need to check the story out. When the plane leveled at 14,500 feet in the air, Joanne Murray took a deep breath and jumped out of the plane. The bank executive from Charlotte, North Carolina, was enjoying her free fall through the air until she pulled the ripcord of her parachute, and nothing happened when she pulled the ripcord of her parachute. Just about then, she had an extreme rush of adrenaline, just about then. But she didn't panic in the process. She knew that she had a backup parachute, even though she was falling at 120 miles per hour through the air. When she released the reserve chute, it opened just fine. That must have been a relief. But she lost her bearings, and in a struggle to balance herself, if you call it that, she deflated the chute in all that struggle. While the chute briefly slowed her descent, she continued to fall at 80 miles per hour, slightly reduced but fast. She struck the earth with a violent blow, shattered her right side, and charred up her fillings from her teeth, or knocked them out if you call it. She was barely conscious, and her heart was beating. Just when it seemed things would not get any worse, she realized that into a mound of fire ants, but didn't appreciate her disturbing her solitude at that time. All told, they stung her about 200 times before the paramedics arrived to the scene. It reminds you of the whole Ehore song, "If it weren't for bad luck, I did have no luck at all." But things are not always as they seem. The doctors treated Joanne, believed that the ants actually saved her life. Wow. They theorized that the stings of the ant shocked her heart enough to keep her heart beating despite such a tragic situation. Now that wasn't luck. It was the providence of God. By providence, I mean that God orchestrated His plan in our favor, despite the circumstances. While God bestows His favor according to His sovereign works, He also bestows His favor in direct response to virtuous living. Virtual reality was a phrase in the mid-90s that came out. While I may never dunk a basketball in real life myself, I can perform the wildest throwdowns in virtual reality world. Unfortunately, Life is lived in the real world that operates on a series of realities. We will call them virtuous realities, i.e., realities that are based on virtual, not luck, fate, or even wishful thinking. Our world operates on several divine principles that impact our lives on a daily basis. And understanding these realities will help us build lasting and more meaningful relationships in life. The first of these virtuous realities is simple. Your obedience to God's plan opens His provisions for you. First, God faithfully orchestrates His plan for our lives. As we addressed at some point, Naomi and Ruth began their return journey to the promised land. Although Naomi's motive was suspect, this act positioned her for God's provision for her life. Notice 4 specific events that God coordinated to perfection as Ruth and Naomi yielded to Him. 1. He moved at the right time. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. God's timing was impeccable at that time. They, as widows, needed the season of harvest to live, March to July, to sustain themselves for the rest of the year. 2. He moved in the right time and period. Naomi had a relative on her husband's side named Boaz. God intersected their lives with the one individual who could rescue them from their poverty. It was a godly relative named Boaz. We see God do this throughout the scripture. It was no coincidence that Philip met the Ethiopian in the desert. It was no accident either. 3. He moved in the right place. She happened to be in the portion of land that belonged to Boaz. Someone was wisely observed that nothing just happens with God. This too was more than just coincidence. It was providence in the making. Do you remember the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman by the well? Although the Jews typically avoided Samaria, John 4 indicates that Jesus needed to go through Samaria. The story then pictures Jesus sitting at the well in Sychar as the woman approached. 4. He moves in the right ways. Boaz asked, "Who is this young woman?" or "Whose young woman is this?" Widows were a common sight in Jewish fields of harvest during that time. It was a provision of their culture to allow widows to pick up the fallen grains left by the harvesters during that time. But Ruth just happened to catch his eye at that moment. It is obvious that Boaz thinks Ruth is special. That's obvious, he thought that. After reading the text, one cannot miss the invincible hand of God orchestrating this entire encounter. 2, God prepares and makes his provision in advance for us. That's what God does. He was a prominent man of noble character from Elimelech's family. If you read the book of Ruth, you know that Boaz is going to marry Ruth. You would know that when you read that book. But think with me now. What is the probability of him not being married already? Does it strike you as unusual that this man of all people was unmarried? Consider what we know about Boaz. 1, he was wealthy. I'm sure this fact about him would have prompted more than one scheming mother to push their daughters in his direction. 2, he was strong. He was a strong man. In the Bible, names were typically given for a reason. Sometimes the name was a descriptive, such as Naomi's 2 sons, Chilion and Malon. The name Boaz means strength. It is reasonable to assume that his parents saw it as a physical characteristic in him. 3, he was a considerate employer. When he greeted his harvesters, he invoked the name of God, and they in response did the same to him. This spiritual dimension of their relationship suggests that the manner in which he treated his employees. 4, he was a virtuous man. The phrase of noble character literally means good virtue. No doubt he had a good standing in the community. Lastly, he was a man of faith. He was church-going man. Not only did he speak of God freely to those who knew him, he also invoked God's name in his first conversation with Ruth, a total stranger. While he was probably a few years older than Ruth, Boaz was Bethlehem's most eligible bachelor at that time, I would say, or one of them. Even if he looked like the hunchback Quasimodo, he was still quite a catch, or the hunchback of Notre Dame, if you call that. 3, God directs the paths of the righteous. That's what God does. From the start of her life, Ruth demonstrated a consistent life of obedience. Disobedience would have had an impact on God's plan. Not necessarily, but God's best for her could have been missed as a result of that. Notice the steps she took as God directed her. 1, she believed God and His word. Would have happened to her if she had rejected God. What if she trusted God but remained where she was? Secondly, she waited patiently. She had no idea of what God wanted to do for her. She was simply taking the step of obedience she knew for the moment. 3, she lived virtuously. She was a virtuous woman. Interestingly, no one told her to look for work or care for her mother-in-law. Instead, she took the initiative to provide for Naomi. What would have happened if she had sat around and waited for someone to take care of her? She was sensitive to God's leading. Many questions come to mind when we read of her searching for food. Was this the first field that she came to? Did others run her off? Did she consider a fork in the road that would have taken her in a different direction? All we do know is that God led her to the right field. That's all we know. This was divinely appointed. 4. God blesses his people in ways that we cannot even conceive. It is important to remember that Ruth did not go looking for a husband. She was looking for food, and Boaz wasn't looking for a wife. He was just checking on a crop. But God intended to bless them both in ways they could not even conceive. Be blessed with 1, unexpected provision for both of them. Through this divine appointment, God intended to not only meet the physical needs of Ruth and Naomi, but also exceed their expectations. What a wonderful God we serve. 2, unseen presence. The greatest blessing that God bestows on anyone is himself. God himself is our greatest blessing. Throughout the story, we cannot miss the presence of God. Typically, we don't see how he works with us, even guided us until some time passes, but we can gain incredible strength in looking back at events and acknowledge that God had to be with us for us to go through that fire. 3, unlimited power. What can we accomplish if God is with us? Whatever God desires for us, this of course forces us to consider one of the hard theological questions: can we thwart God's purpose? The simple answer is no. The hard part for humans is to discern what is and or is not God's purpose. That is the hard part for humans. Until your faith becomes sight and God himself explains his greater plans to us, we live with the knowledge our obedience to his plans opens his provisions for our lives. So how do we conclude this, people of Brixton? Sometimes when your plans don't work out as you expect, it is because God is detouring you. That is why. Leading you elsewhere in his overruling providence. Thomas Cook, a sophisticated Oxford-educated Welshman, left his ministry in 1777 to become John Wesley's chief assistant in the new and quickly moving Methodist church movement at that time. In 1785, he packed his books and his bags and sailed from England down the Channel and into the Atlantic, leaving for Nova Scotia, where he wanted to establish a group of missionaries who accompanied him at that time. But the voyage was ill-fated and grew more perilous by the day as he went. The ship, being caught in mountainous waves and mass-splitting winds, the ship's captain determined that Cook and his missionaries, like biblical Jonah, were bringing misfortune on his ship, and he considered throwing them overboard as a result of that. He did, in fact, gather some of Cook's papers and toss them into the raging ocean or winds. The voyage took 3 months rather than 1 month. Instead of landing in Nova Scotia, the damaged ship ended up in the Caribbean, limping into St. John's Harbor on the island of Antigua on Christmas Day. Cook knew at least one Methodist lived somewhere in Antigua, a missionary named John Baxter. Hoping to find him, Cook and his 3 missionaries asked to be rolled ashore from their shattered ship in the pre-dawn morning. They started down the street of St. John's and stopped the first person they found, a fellow swinging a lantern in his hand, to inquire. It was John Baxter himself. Wow, what a surprise, eh? He was on his way for a special Christmas morning service he had planned for the island at that time. The sudden appearance of Cook and his missionaries out of the darkness, out of nowhere, seemed too good to be true. It took 3 services that day to accommodate. Afterward, Cook and his associates abandoned any idea of going to Nova Scotia. They planted the missionary team instead on Antigua and on neighboring islands. By the time of Cook's death in 1814, there were over 17,000 believers in the Methodist churches in that vicinity. Wow, amazing, astounding, eh? So that is a wonderful thing. Now, love is in the air. Over the past 30 years, our society has greatly diminished in value of love and marriage and the home today. Charles Swindoll captured our casual, if not irreverent, attitude towards love, marriage, and the home. In the words of one woman who wanted to marry 4 men, first, she wanted to marry a banker. Then she hoped to marry an actor. Next, she desired to marry a preacher. And finally, she wanted to marry a funeral director. When asked why in that order, she responded, 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready, 4 to go. While many desire a culture without responsibility and commitment, love and marriage have hardly died in this process. As we have seen in our discussion of Ruth, many circumstances stress the home today. Some walk away from their commitments, others stay in the relationship out of obligation, yet experience bitterness and emptiness. Meanwhile, some experience fulfillment because of their disposition, adversity. Chapter 2, from foundation stones of long-lasting relationships. Faith in God, virtuous living, mutual respect, and redeeming love. Yes, love is possible for you and through you if you realize this one simple truth. Love is an act of the will, not the emotion. Ruth 3 has a beautiful portrait of human love. While we can feel love, the pillars of love, of true love should I say, are all actions or acts of the will. Under the veneer of this true love story, one will also find a parable of divine love. 1, a portrait of human love. There are 3 scenes in this love story. 1, a matchmaking mother. Early in the story of Naomi, realized what Ruth could not have realized. She understood the kinsman's obligation to marry the widow of a close relative and the interest of Boaz already had in Ruth as well. So Naomi takes action on behalf of her daughter-in-law. Notice her concern for Ruth. Now, Naomi knew that it only takes a spark to build a fire. 2, notice her counsel to Ruth. Naomi offered 2 types to Ruth. First, she told her to fix herself up. This meant Ruth had to remove the garments of mourning that she had on. This would indicate that she had finished mourning and ready to move on with her life. 3, notice Ruth's compliance to Naomi. Even here, we see a unique and trusting relationship between the two of them. B, a midnight meeting. Ruth follows through with the rendezvous at destination grain heap. Now, doesn't that sound a bit romantic? Consider this meeting, you need to understand some things about it. 1, an unusual practice. There was nothing immoral or indecent about this custom. It was simply the woman's way of letting him know that she was interested.